Welcome to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, a series of educational podcasts that showcase the connection between human capabilities and good work design, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia. Hi everyone, welcome back to the HFE Hub. I'm Sharon Todd, and today I'm chatting with Dr. William Marras, a distinguished university professor who holds the Honda Endowed Chair in Integrated Systems Engineering at The Ohio State University. So, Bill, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast with me today. Thank you so much for joining us. You are a very well-respected researcher in musculoskeletal injuries, and particularly in back injuries. And I'm thrilled to be chatting with you today because I know that the people listening to the podcast will want to know a little bit more about you and some of the work that you've done. I'm quite sure many of us, including myself, have used your research in our work, and thank you for that. But it would be great for you to tell the listeners on our podcast how you got into human factors and ergonomics and what sparks your interest these days.
Yeah. So first off, Sharon, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to meet your audience virtually, and looking forward to the conversation. So how did I get into this area? Well, that's an interesting story. So it all started when I was a undergraduate in college. And I went to college on a basketball scholarship, and I was studying engineering and also playing basketball, obviously. And I was just thinking as I was going through my program, it's like, how could I use my, engineering knowledge and engineering skills to help understand what happens when I'm, playing basketball, and especially when I get hurt. Because, all athletes eventually get hurt, and I was the lucky one who had plenty of experience in that area. And so just while you're healing and things like that, you just sort of wonder, okay, how could this have been different? How could I have changed this? So I started, thinking about, okay, how could I meld these two worlds? And then as an undergrad, I also got a part-time job with a professor there, Dr. Malcolm Ritchie, who was in the area of human factors. So he did a very different kind of human factors. He was doing, aviation human factors. And, so I started working in his laboratory part-time, and, and I would articulate to him how interested I was in, combining these two areas. And so, we started talking, and, when it came to the end of my undergraduate career, he started telling me about, why don't you think of going to graduate school? And I was like, well, I don't know much about graduate school, but, sure, why not? Sort of my attitude. And he started telling me about the way that, you could study human factors, you could learn about the human, combine it with engineering, and that's where the future is. And so I took him up on that, and he suggested I go study with some people at Wayne State in Michigan, where a fellow named Julian Christensen was, who's well known for his human factors work. He's the two-time president of the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society. And so, I connected with him, and then he connected me with a fellow named Eberhard Kromer, who was an engineer who also did physical work. And so this is finally my opportunity to bring these two worlds together. And so I thought, okay, I'll go get a master's degree, and that'll be all fun and games, and, I'll go out and make some money. And then I got involved in a couple of these studies and found out I really enjoyed them. It's like, I found something I was really good at and really enjoyed, and it was not work to me. So, Kromer convinced me to go get a PhD, and that's kind of how it all got rolling. And I really enjoyed it. And unfortunately, I moved to another university when I started my PhD program, but he connected me with a guy named Albert King, who was a world-renowned bioengineering professor. He did all the crash testing in Detroit of all the automobiles and with humans and cadavers in them, and took measurements on them. So I learned how to be very, very quantitative and how to use my engineering skills to understand what's happening with people. And so that was sort of my path. And it was very, like all paths in life, they're fortuitous, right? So you think you've got this plan. My plan was to be a professional basketball player, but that wasn't going to work. So instead of, I found this other path after a couple turns that all sort of pointed me in the same direction. And I was very fortunate that my dream came true of mixing engineering as well as physiology and human factors, because as you probably realize, a lot of ergonomics and human factors is very non-quantitative, and I was able to sort of bring quantification to it, which became my hallmark. So it's a long answer to your short question.
Oh, no, it's a fascinating answer in actual fact. And I was fascinated to hear how people get into human factors. And the story is often the same, meeting people and becoming interested and discovering a world that we never knew about when we first stepped into our university studies. So what are you working on these days then?
I've been working on understanding spines for, decades now, and I'm still working on that. So, the whole thing about understanding, low back disorders and neck disorders is, as a society, we're terrible at understanding those problems. And that's one of the things that keeps me in it is, as I just described, given my background, I thought I could quantify everything. And after my first couple projects, I learned that, okay, you really can't quantify human behavior very well, or human actions very well. And so I started expanding, and it sort of expanded again away from I still use a quantification, but I included a lot of the non-quantitative stuff, like the way people think and the way they behave and their anxiety and their depression and their sleep. And so the major thread going through all my research is we're trying to not separate people at the neck. And what I mean by that is, those of us in physical ergonomics for decades have only worried about the physical world around us and, how muscles are strained and how joints are compressed and sheared. Yet we didn't pay any attention to how people think and what goes on in the brain. And so what I'm trying to do is bring those two worlds together. So bring the brain and the body together, because what I've learned in our causal pathway research is that there's a lot of connection there that is really important. If you can understand the physical plant, you got to understand the mental plant and vice versa. And so a lot of what we're finding is that if you look at the forces that are imposed on the spine, they're mediated by how you think, what your anxiety is, what your depression is, what your sleep profile is, what your psychosocial profile is, how you interact with the world around you. And so we've been able to tease that out, and we're just going down that path because we think that's where a lot of the answers lie in prevention, as well as the answers in terms of how to treat people. And it's kind of interesting in how I got into this, because back around the late 90s and early 2000s, the United States was considered an ergonomic standard. So ergonomics is not standardized here, it's voluntary, but a lot of countries were turning them into standards, and the US was considering that. And so I was part of a group that was funded by the US Congress to look at the work-relatedness of musculoskeletal disorders. Musculoskeletal disorders are obviously huge, and there's been a big political fight in the US as well as around the world. Some people think it's work-related. Some people never thought it's work-related. And, Congress is divided. And so they hired the National Academy of Sciences to do the study, and the National Academy of Sciences, included me in the study. And so when we did our study, we looked at causal pathways, and basically we found there are several, let's call them buckets of science that popped up in the literature. And one is what we've been talking about, the physical stuff, right? So physical exposures lead to tissue breakdown and pain and injury, things like that. And then there's all this personal side where certain people are more susceptible to back injuries than others. And then there's this other area, this other bucket that was called psychosocial, that says that the way you're treated in your environment, mentally has a big role in it. And of course, being the biomechanist in me was saying, well, there's nothing to that. It's just, more reporting. And, these people aren't happy, so they report more injuries, whether they're hurt or not. And that was my attitude going into it. But once we started looking at the literature, there seemed to be a lot of evidence there too, just as much as there was in the other two buckets. And so we did a study. We did a study, sort of a study we just funded on our own because it was interesting. I teamed up with a psychosocial professor here at Ohio State, and we decided to run the study. We have all kinds of very elegant biomechanical assessments where we could, wire up people with electromyography and figure out what's the loads are on the spine, real time as people are doing things. And then, so we performed the study where, that I designed with a psychosocial professor and myself. And what we did was we brought people into the lab. We had them do some standard lifting tests, and we altered the psychosocial environment around them. So the first part of the study is, my colleague taught my graduate students how to be very engaging, how to smile in front of the subject, how to whistle, turn on the radio, make small talk, just engage them in a very positive way. And then halfway through the study, I would walk in the room and I would disrupt the study. And so I would all of a sudden start talking to my graduate students, say, what are you doing? You're doing this all wrong. This was not the way we talked about doing this study. You're messing it all up. You're never going to graduate at this rate. You messed up yet another experiment. What's wrong with you? And so and this is all fake, obviously, but we needed to make the subject believe it. And so we'd go out of the room, slam the door, and pretend we were having this argument, and then let the subject think about this for about 5 minutes. Then the graduate student would go back in the room, and all they'd say is, we've got to do this again. So that's all they told the subject, and they turned off the radio, they stopped smiling, stopped making eye contact, stopped the small talk, and all they did is repeat the same exact experiment that we did previously, same conditions, and then we looked at the data. And it turned out that for some subjects, the loading on the spine was 35% greater under those negative psychosocial conditions than others, than other people. And then when we looked in the data a little more, it turned out it was people with certain personality profiles that were reacting and the other ones were not. For example, introverts were greatly bothered by this behavior. So they're the ones that experienced the 35% increase in loading. And the extroverts hardly had any increase in loading. They couldn't care less, right? And so this opened my eyes, and all of a sudden I became a believer in that, what happens in the brain has a lot to do with, what happens in the rest of the body, and it's the environment around you that can influence that. And, what we were trying to figure out is how could this possibly be? And what we found when we looked at the data is that these introverts were co-contracting the muscles in their torso in a very different way from the extroverts. And so they were co-contracting all their muscles, which was causing sort of a fight between the muscles, or a tug of war between the muscles. And the end result were there was more compression here on the spine. So that's what got me down that road of taking a look at, what happens in the brain and how does that affect the body. And that's what we're still doing today. And we're doing it a little bit differently today, because today we're doing it with not only people with, who are uninjured, but we're also doing it with people with back pain. So some of the studies we're working on now are are trying to figure out how these loading pathways occur with people with low back disorders. And we've been collecting data on people throughout the United States using our technology to measure how people move. And what we're finding is that, motion is very indicative of what's going on. Motion tells you a lot about how they're loading the spine. But we're also finding things like sleep and depression and anxiety have a lot to do with it too. Those people with more back pain seem to have more of those other factors I just mentioned. And we just completed a study here that we're about to publish showing that people who have back pain, when you compare them against matched controls, have more loading of the spine. So people with back pain, just walking around with back pain is going to load your spine more. So it's more of a cumulative trauma that's always there. Yet it's a very different kind of cumulative trauma because it's not just maximum loads. What we're finding is the minimum loads or the resting loads are much, much higher in those people with back pain. So at a very high level, those are the kinds of things I'm working on these days.
How did you do these studies?
Let me talk for a bit about how you model the spine, because if we understand that, then we can understand why co-contraction is so important. So, most historical models of the spine have been what we call inverse dynamics in engineering. So basically, if I'm going to lift something, an inverse dynamic model will simply say, okay, here's the angle of your back, and there's a muscle in your back that supports that bend, and how much force do we need in that muscle to just counterbalance that bend that you're occurring. And then if you're lifting something while you're bending, you got to add that amount of force, right? So that's an inverse dynamics, and you basically take those muscles on all the extension muscles of the body, and you say, okay, that's the total force. And the way we measure that traditionally is with, electromyography, and you just can't take electromyography and take the raw reading and measure it. You got to calibrate it. EMG means nothing unless you calibrate it properly. And so we do things like looking at the cross-section area of the muscles and how quickly that muscle is moving and what the length of the muscle is and what is the potential of that muscle to generate force. And all this goes into our equations of the model. And from there, we can figure out exactly how much force that muscle is producing, add it to the body mass and its mechanical advantage relative to the spine. And that's where you figure out what force is. But what we're finding in the way people really work is not just as an inverse dynamics mechanism or machine. We also have the agonist muscle, antagonist muscles working. So we have the abdominal muscles working. We have the internal oblique muscles working. We have the latissimus dorsi working. We have all these muscles that surround the spine that are kicking in to support that motion. And also that could be biased by the way you think is what we're finding. So there's the stability component where I need to recruit enough muscles and enough co-contraction so I won't fall over when I'm doing this. But we're also finding that you could bias those recruitment of those muscles by the way you think. If you're depressed, if you're trying to guard against back pain, you're going to recruit a lot of muscles that you don't need to recruit just to perform the lift. Same thing with anxiety, same thing with sleep. All this stuff affects it. And we're just starting to begin to understand personality affects it, as I just described. And so that's what we mean by co-contraction, is employing muscles that you don't need to employ from a physics standpoint to perform the task. Yet as humans, we recruit them, right? And if you could just turn them off, that would be great. But we don't. And I guess as a little sidebar on this, one of the things I did, I'm always following these weird paths in life. So one of the things I did when I was a young associate professor is I earned a black belt in karate. And the reason I did that is because I wanted to understand the biomechanics of people who were engaged in karate. Because here you have these often very little people who are able to generate enormous amounts of force with their body, and so I spent 10 years studying that and, earning my black belt and figuring out different techniques. And basically the common element that I learned that applied to the biomechanics is these people train themselves how to turn off their antagonistic muscles and how to only apply the agonist muscles, and timing is everything. So you need stability to, get in the right posture. But when you throw that punch, you need to turn off all the antagonistic muscles, and that gives you the power to perform to get the power out of the punch. And so that opened my eyes, and that made me a real believer in coactivity. And we've been following that trail now for probably 20 years because it seems to be the common element, and everything in that explains musculoskeletal stress. We find it's true in the neck. We find it's true in the low back, true in the forearms. Everywhere we look, we see it.
Gosh, that's interesting. I'm rather relieved I wasn't actually in the same room with you, just in case I got you upset. A black belt in karate, well done. You were listening to the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society podcast. If this podcast sparks your interest in human factors and ergonomics, why not join us? You can find out more by searching for us at ergonomics.org.au, where you can join the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, who offers unique insights through our conferences, professional networking and events in this growing scientific field. Have you only done studies in the low back? Have you done studies? You mentioned the neck just then. I have seen lots of musculoskeletal injuries in warehousing and things like that in the neck, and I think that's underreported or understudied might be the right phrase. Where are you in that space?
No, I think there are two questions there. Do we only do studies of the back, or are we doing warehousing?
Yeah, are you doing some studies in the neck? Are you getting the same results, I suppose, is one of the questions I would ask.
We also are doing studies of the back. So, the easiest way to look at a physical assessment of somebody, as I was alluding to in my previous comments, is simply watch how they move. So there's a lot of information that's contained within motion. And let me just digress a little bit and tell you how I got here and why I think it's so important, which is, when I first got to Ohio State, I started interviewing, MDs and asking them, how do you assess backs? Because I needed to understand this causal pathway. How do backs get hurt? Unless you understand that, what do your ergonomic assessments really mean? Because I didn't know whether I believed a lot of the ergonomic assessments that are based on posture only and things like that. So that started me asking questions about, how physicians evaluate backs. And so some of the most insightful information I got was from some of the really good spine physicians who told me, because I was asking, do you look at MRIs? Do you look at CTs? How do you do this? And they say, I don't need to do that. And what they told me is, all I got to do is watch the person as they get up from their chair in the waiting room and walk into my office, the examining room. And I just look at the quality of their motion as they sit back down. That's my exam. And then the rest of it is questioning. And so that got me thinking that there is a lot of information embedded in motion. And so, I teamed up with one of these physicians and we did a very simple study. So we got, this is a chronic pain service that she ran. And so we got everybody on that service. And then we got all the residents that were under her supervision. And we had them wear this very, very crude instrument on the back that simply measures the motion. And we simply had them pick up a roll of tape from the floor. And so we did that with the patients. Then we did it with the residents. And we tried to see, is it just the angle that distinguishes between these two groups, or is it the motion? And lo and behold, we found that there's a little bit of change in angle, but huge differences in the motion patterns. And so that was the first study we did. We published that. It got a lot of attention, and that sent me down this path to build a better lumbar motion monitor that's, available now. And we started doing, more and more studies on how people move, and we include that in almost everything we do now. As a matter of fact, we just finished a study with the National Institutes of Health here in the United States, where we've been collecting data on back patients, chronic back patients, in 12 academic medical centers across the United States. And they're all using our technology to record their motions. And so this And then we also got a group of controls, people who don't have back pain, and we're simply asking the difference, what's the difference between these two groups? And that's where we're using things like artificial intelligence to sort of, explore, pick out the features that are indicative of what's unique about the people, those motions in the patients compared to the people who don't have back pain. And so that got me moving on down this road of motion. And to get back to your question, we've simply taken that and applied it now to the neck. And so we're also collecting data on hundreds of people with neck pain and comparing that to the control. Same idea there. We're also using it for shoulders. So let's look at the motion of shoulders and people who've got shoulder pain versus people who don't. And because, if you look at the majority of the ergonomic standards right now, the ergonomic guidelines simply look at posture, right? And we've known since the days of Isaac Newton that force is equal to mass times acceleration, but we completely ignore the acceleration. And as an engineer, that just doesn't compute with me. So that's why this is what we're trying to bring to the field is the understanding of how motion fits in, how you could easily measure it, and how you could apply it to the different parts of the body, like we've done it for the neck, we've done it for the low back, we've done it for the shoulder, we've done it for the wrist. What extra information does that provide that helps you understand what the risk is and help you diagnose what the problems may be? The other part of your question was about warehousing. I've got a huge interest in warehousing. I also understand that there are a lot of neck problems in warehousing, which I don't know why yet. And we haven't done a study there, but that's one of the things we're hoping to do is sort of look at the motions of the low back as well as the motions of the neck as people are doing various warehousing tests.
I've heard you talk about, is it a spinal signature or a back pain signature? Tell me about that.
Motion signature.
Motion signature.
That is your unique fingerprint of that motion. So it's what's unique about the way you accelerate, the way you decelerate, the speeds that you obtain, the velocities you obtain, how far you move, just all the characteristics of the, what we call the kinematics of the motion that are unique to you. And there are some similarities between people, but there's also a lot of heterogeneous motion between people. So everybody moves a little bit different, but you can also categorize it into sort of major buckets or bands that relate to whether people are experiencing pain or not. So like I said, there's a wealth of information in the motion. And we find that if you understand the motion, it gives you insights to what's happening inside the body. And that's what we're ultimately interested in. And that's where our models come in. And so with these thousands of people we're looking at across the United States, we've collected over 20,000 recordings of these people now. And we're trying to understand what does that mean from not only a motion signature standpoint, but from a biomechanical standpoint. How does that relate to the amount of force that people with back pain or without back pain are experiencing? We're seeing that there is a relationship there, but how much is too much, right? That's what we're trying to answer. How much motion or how much load in the spine makes your spine pain linger for years as opposed to resolving itself very quickly.
So you mentioned that this research, obviously, apart from identifying what's going on, but also it will assist or is assisting in prevention. Maybe we just go to that space for a moment. A lot of us don't talk about that in podcasts. We talk about, obviously, the studies and things that we found. But tell me about some of the preventions, things that you think need to be in the workplace that will make a difference to back pain.
So, I work with, I've got a lot of funding from the government, and I also work with a lot of industry that is asking me to help them prevent back pain in their various facilities. And we're able to do this, but only if people pay attention to the recommendations. And, what we find is people take this Band-Aid approach where, okay, Professor Marras told us this is bad. We'll change that. Problem will go away. Thank you. See you next time. Right? And so that's kind of the attitude. But what we find is people they don't recognize where the risk is because they're not using tools that are often sensitive enough. So I guess, an example, you can't use a stethoscope to analyze an ankle injury, right? And you find a lot of people will use the same hammer for everything, right? That's not the way it works. And so I see a lot of people misusing tools that are meant for identification. They try and use those to fix problems, and that's not the way it works. And I just see people making that mistake over and over and over. When they do, identify where the problems are, they don't use tools that are appropriate for the nature of the problem. If it's a highly dynamic task and they're using static models, we already talked about that. That's not going to work, right? And so they got to recognize, am I addressing the risk factors that are there? They got to identify, they also need to be sensitive to the characteristics of the worker. Ergonomics is about making the job safe for everybody, but we also, it's really hard to do. You can't have 85-year-old little old ladies working in warehouses, that we know that it's going to be really hard to accommodate them, right? And so you need to pay attention to who your workforce is, what the characteristics are. Are you designing at appropriate threshold levels for your target population? And finally, you have to appreciate that it is a process, so just applying some ergonomic solutions and walking away from the job doesn't mean you fix the job. You've got to keep on going back, seeing whether things have changed, seeing whether they've adapted the job, in a way that created new risks. I see that all the time, so fix this, and everything will be fine. The ergonomist walks away and never comes back. I always go back. I mark it on my calendar, go back in a month, go back in 2 months, go back in 6 months. Go check out that job, see whether new problems have popped up. And you also have to convince the company that that is worth doing. You have to convince the company that that is worth doing and that, they need to pay attention to the future times also. And so that's extremely important. And also, I think another neglected area is getting the buy-in of the worker. So when I implement solutions, I try and look at the 360-degree view of the work, which includes where's the worker's head at, right? Are they part of the solution or not? And I want to make them part of the solution, even if I know exactly what's going to solve the problem. I will ask the worker, what do you think will solve this? And if they're not giving me the answer that I think it is, I'll kind of lead them to what I think the right solution is without me telling them what it is and trying to get them to come up with that, what I think is the best answer. And if they think it's their answer and then you implement it, you've got to win. They'll use it correctly, they'll stick with it, and you've got to win. So that's how I approach the ergonomic in the workplace itself.
Are there any particular tools, given that you've obviously been talking about psychosocial factors in the workplace, and these are huge issues in the workplace these days, are there particular tools that you think address this better than others, or is there a favourite one that you use?
So we use what's called the NIH minimum data set, which is a series of short questionnaires. And, there are things like, very short anxiety questionnaires, very short psychosocial questionnaires, things like that. And the name of it is PROMISE. I don't know what PROMISE stands for, but that's what they're called within NIH. So we use those surveys, and we've got them all computerized now. So we simply give the subject or the patient a tablet, and they just check off what they use, and it's automatically included along with our motion information and everything else we're looking at.
Does it deliver on the promise?
Well, it's a research tool, right? So that's it's better than me judging without the tools. Let's put it that way. So
what's next? What are you studying? I mean, what you've studied is amazing so far anyway. But I must say, by the way, and I'm being a little bit tangential at this point, I know that you've got a TED Talk that's back pain in your brain. So I'll put that information in the bottom of the podcast software for people who are listening. But I imagine that that's covering a very similar, well, it's talking about the things that you've been studying, clearly.
Yeah, yeah. No,
Yeah,
well, thanks for that. Yeah,
that's
that
okay.
about a lot of the things I've talked about today, and sort of that's about a few years old, but it shows how I started down this path and what made me think of that. And you see the visuals that way also. But
So what's up for you now?
yeah, so we're still going on this path. Same thing I've been doing. I know it sounds like I'm doing more of the same, but we're kind of doing more of the same because there's still a lot to discover. The way I remember when I first started this job. Well, let me even go back to graduate school. So in graduate school, for my dissertation, I was originally proposed to my advisor that I do a study that looks at what happens with the dynamics of the elbow, right? And so I was wanted to evaluate all the forces in the elbow and everything, and I came up with this great plan using EMG and you know vision assessment and things like that to figure out what's going on. And so I went to my advisor and I presented it to him, and he said, that's a great idea, and if you want to do that, you could do that, and you'll get your PhD. But if you take those same concepts and apply them to the back, you'll have something to do for the rest of your life. And here I am, 40 years later, still doing the same thing, and we're making incremental progress doing this, but we are making progress. And like I said, here for a very rigid engineer, I've come to embrace all the psychosocial world and biopsychosocial world. And so I'm just trying to put all this stuff together now and trying to understand the human system. That's kind of the way I view the world now. As a matter of fact, I wrote a book a few years ago called The Working Back, a Systems View. And it's all about the system, and how the different pieces of that system fit together. And I'm still following that path because the more I explore it, the more I think that's where the answers are gonna lie ultimately. I guess in general, we're trying to understand all these different pieces. More specifically, what we're trying to do is take some of this technology that we've developed and try and commercialize it. So, it's great to do research, and that's my world. That's my first love, is just understanding research, and discovering new things gives me just a great feeling. It's my joy in life, is just coming up with new findings and things like that makes me very happy. But I also realize that, keeping that in journals and keeping that in the laboratory just only helps a limited number of people. So now we're trying to commercialize some of this technology we've developed and, get it out there so physicians around the world could use it, for ergonomists around the world could use it. And so we've got these two tracks. One is the ergonomic assessments of this technology. Our technologies, we've dubbed it Conity is the name of it, CONITY, and it's short for contiguous, or consanity. So basically it's sort of the bringing together of all things, which is kind of what I described in terms of our research. And we're trying to do that for the ergonomics world. So we have Conity Ergo, and then we're doing that for the clinical world, which is Conity Care. And so we're going to hope to put these in the hands of physicians. We've got this little thing in the United States called the Food and Drug Administration, which has to bless all this stuff. So it's a long road, but we're going down that path. But with the Ergo road, that's much shorter, and so that should be out, pretty quickly here. So that's what the future holds for me.
Are you using AI in anything that you're doing?
A lot. Okay, I know there's a lot of controversy around the world about AI, but I think there's a lot of different kinds of AI, right? So we use the AI that is used for data analysis. It's almost like a statistical analysis. So we use dimensional reduction techniques and model building techniques and clustering techniques. And so the benefit of AI is we could take all this diverse data, like just hundreds and hundreds of different, signals in the data, and boil it down to like one or two dimensions. And we do that with back problems. So I mentioned the study we're doing across the United States with our motion technology and giving people all these questionnaires and trying to understand how their depression and anxiety and all this stuff work. And we're letting AI cut through the data and figure out Well, what separates the people who've got chronic low back pain for a long time, what we call high burden low back pain, and those who have low burden back pain, and those who have medium burden low back pain? And oh, by the way, let's look at the treatments these people have had and see which ones work for different people. AI can tell you that kind of stuff. And so it basically, the way I describe it is AI can tell us where to look. It doesn't tell us how it works, but it tells us where to look. And then it's up to us to uncover all the rocks at that point and try and figure out why it's doing what it's doing. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes we're not smart enough to uncover the whys, but for the most part, it saves us years, if not decades, of telling us where to look. Because if I did a controlled study on every one of these, it would take hundreds of years. But now with this one study, we've got so much information, and it's all about collecting a lot of data. So like I said, we've done 20,000 tests. And that's what you need to have a powerful AI model, to reduce that dimensionality to just a couple factors that are really important. And so that's what we're able to do. And then there's the other type of AI, which is, large language models that you talk to on your computer, and generative AI, which, are going to tell you what the next move and stuff like that. We don't use that. That is a whole different animal. And those are the ones where they have a lot of hallucinations, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, but you don't know which is which. And so we try and stay away from that and stick with the analytical AI and explainable AI. So it's been a huge tool for us, and it's really changed the way we look at the world.
Thank you so much for your time today. I've so much appreciated it. And we've just danced around so lightly in what has been an incredible world of research that you've worked in. And I'm really enthusiastic to maybe chat with you again sometime about research outcomes on other parts of the body, the neck, and other projects that you're working on.
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk to your listeners. I'm looking forward to the next time.
Thanks for joining us at the Human Factors and Ergonomics Hub, brought to you by the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society of Australia, where human-centred design really matters. If you like this podcast, make us your favourite in your podcast app. We look forward to chatting with you next time.